Hello, BISC130. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 5.3, more ecology stuff. So we've done populations, we've done communities, we've done ecosystems, and now we're expanding all the way out to the biosphere, all the ecosystems on the entire planet. So this is sort of the largest scale, the biggest picture we could get. And really, there's a lot in this chapter, but there is one thing in particular that I want to focus on for this entire chapter. I feel like we have to talk about the big topic when it comes to biosphere level ecology. We got to talk about global warming. So also known as global climate change, and both names will make sense after we've gone through this, but this is going to be my big topic for this entire recorded lecture. And you'll notice I'm double underlining this because there's going to be some stuff underneath this, just how I organize things. All right. So let's start by looking at temperature. So, okay, a lot of graphs here. Anytime anyone shows you a graph, whether it's in a classroom or in any other context, you always have to look at the axes to understand what you're being shown. So what we are looking at here is average global temperature on this axis here. And these are small numbers. This is notably in degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. But we are looking at temperature of the entire planet change from year to year. And again, always look at the axes. We're looking at real deep time. So we're looking at hundreds of thousands of years before the present. And you might wonder, how do we know what the temperature was 300,000 years ago? Well, obviously there was no accurate census taker at all different points in the world, but we can extrapolate this information from ice core data. So ice freezes with different amounts of things dissolved in it based on what temperature it is. And yeah, by digging really deep into really old ice, we can calculate what the temperature would have been like really long periods of time ago. So this is how we're getting these data, and these are what the data look like. So immediately we're seeing some ups and some downs. It seems to be cyclic. There seem to be cycles here of going up and going down, and this is completely natural. This has nothing to do with us as humans who weren't around these hundreds of thousands of years ago, and so this is an important observation to make. The planet Earth experiences natural cyclic changes in its overall global temperatures. And don't want to get too deeply into why this is true, but there are several reasons for this that, again, don't have to do with us as humans. They have to do with the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, and they have to do with things like fluctuations in solar intensity and volcanism, volcanic activity, which is also something that comes in cycles. I'm just going to summarize these little things by saying the following. We've got natural changes caused by, slight changes in the Earth's orbit, fluctuations in solar intensity, and volcanic activity. Again, all of these things, aside from us, outside of our control, that's responsible for this. However, global temperatures have increased rapidly outside of the scale of these normal fluctuations, especially in about the last century. So if we look at a graph that doesn't go back quite so far, we've sort of zoomed in a bit. Again, if you're looking at a graph, always look at the scale. We're looking at changes in degrees Celsius, and these years are year 2000. We're only going back 2,000 years instead of 400,000 years. And yeah, there's some very minor ups and downs once we've zoomed into this 2,000 year scale. But yeah, in the last 150 years, and again, direct measurements, we did have people, taking the temperature around the globe at this point, massive spike upwards. So this is way faster than what we would anticipate from, these natural changes. This seems to be not something caused by, these natural factors. There seems to be something else at play for this to happen on this time scale and with such a high slope. So this is a little concerning, but the question is, why? What's going on with this? Well, to answer that question, we back up a second and show something different. Actually, I say different, but it looks pretty much the same. But, read the axes, always. In this graph, we're not looking at temperature. We're looking at the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And yep, there's the axis here, CO2 concentration, and the axis down here is about what we were looking at before with our real zoomed out hundreds of thousands of years ago. And once again, we get these from ice core data to see what the atmospheric CO2 levels were like 400,000 years ago. And we see that, yeah, just like temperature, there were cyclic changes in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Not caused by us, by humans at all, all these hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's natural for these things to happen. However, in the last century or so, these levels have spiked very high, not only at a higher slope than what is naturally seen, but to a higher degree than what has naturally been seen in the past few 100,000 years. So, very similar statement. Earth experiences natural cyclic changes in atmospheric CO2 levels. However, atmospheric CO2 levels have increased rapidly in the last century. We see it in here, and if you want to zoom in a bit, here's a zoom in panel only looking at the last 2,000 years, and yeah, we can see last 100 years or so really starting to spike up very, very rapidly. So why did I present these two things? They look similar to one another, but just having two graphs that look the same is not by itself an explanation. If I want to say one causes the other or one leads to the other, or that there's any sort of link between these two graphs, between these two phenomena at all, there has to be an explanation that links them. And in this case, there is. The phenomenon that links CO2 levels and global temperature is something called the greenhouse effect. So let's take a look at greenhouse effect here. Here's our lovely planet. Our lovely planet is being bombarded with solar rays from the sun, which is great. We need this. It powers the water cycle, evaporation, and precipitation. It powers photosynthesis. Sunlight is good. Plenty of this sunlight is used by stuff on the planet for all those things I just mentioned, but a lot of this sunlight is reflected off of things on the planet. That reflected sunlight can go back into space. That's how we're able to see the planet from space because, sunlight is bouncing off of it going back into space. And notably, all the energy, remember sunlight, photons, they carry energy. All the energy here from this sunlight is being reflected and going off into space. That happens to some of the reflected sunlight. But some other of the reflected sunlight will bounce off the planet, go out, and strike molecules or gases within the atmosphere. So here's a carbon dioxide, but there are other gases in the atmosphere as well. This is just one of the main ones. This sunlight will strike carbon dioxide and then come back down to the planet another time. Cause more evaporation, release more of its heat energy, and then be reflected again. And maybe it'll go off into space, or maybe it'll hit another CO2 or another gas molecule in the atmosphere and come back down again. And so the important thing here is that this atmosphere is kind of helping to bottle in some of this heat energy. If you have more of an atmosphere, if you have more of these gases, there's going to be a higher chance that these photons strike the gases and come back to the planet. If you have a thicker atmosphere, less of this sun energy is going to be escaping, and more of it is going to be returning to the planet. So, in summary, my best way of trying to explain this succinctly is the following. Sunlight hits the Earth, raises its temperature. Again, light has energy, temperature is a measurement of that energy. Most light is reflected back into space, but gases in the atmosphere, like CO2, bounce this reflected light back to Earth again. More greenhouse gases cause more light to return to Earth, leading to increased global temperatures. Let me give you an interesting anecdote here about atmosphere and atmosphere thickness. Not an anecdote, more just a fact. So, if we look at our solar system as a whole, not to scale, trying to be to scale, but not perfectly to scale. Yeah, we got the sun, we got all these planets. Intuitively, if I were to ask you what the hottest planet is, most people would say Mercury, and it makes sense. It's the closest to the sun. It should be the hottest planet. The hottest planet in our solar system is actually not Mercury, it's Venus. Don't memorize any of these numbers, obviously, but yeah, Mercury, average temperature, 167, Venus, like over double that, and certainly higher than any of these other planets. The reason why Venus is so hot, even so much hotter than Mercury, which is closer to the sun, is because Venus has an incredibly thick atmosphere. Lots of gases present in its atmosphere, so a lot of that light energy, even though less of it is coming to it than to Mercury, it's bottling in more of this. So this is just, an interesting demonstration of what the greenhouse effect can look like, on the solar scale. More greenhouse gases means more heat bottled in, means higher temperature. This is, again, how we link these two phenomena. Increased CO2 leads to increased temperature. Which, of course, leads us to the question, why is there increased CO2? Well, we know exactly why there's increased CO2. That is from stuff we've been doing, especially in the last 150 years. We are digging up things like coal, petroleum products, oil, natural gases, and we are burning those things for electricity, for transportation, for industry, all this sort of stuff. These things, coal and petroleum, these are organic molecules. These are hydrocarbons. They're carbon-containing molecules that were fixed long ago by living things, mostly trees and bacteria that are long dead, and now they've been fossilized, kind of. They've been preserved into these chemical compounds, but once we break them apart, just like when we do cellular respiration in our bodies, we take these complicated organic molecules and we convert them to carbon dioxide. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of this in the last 150 years. That's causing the increased CO2 in the atmosphere instead of being buried deep within the earth and, coal or whatever. Now it's out into the atmosphere, increased CO2 because of the greenhouse effect, leading to increased temperatures. So, in summary, in the last century, again, approximately, human-caused CO2 emissions have increased due to just industrialization. I'm not making you memorize the pie chart. This is industrialization as a whole. Burning coal, natural gas, and petroleum for mostly transportation and electricity. So, one thing you might be wondering is why I'm talking about this in a biology class. This sounds like geology or maybe even astronomy as I talk about things like this. Why is a biologist going off about these, increases in global temperature? Well, this is incredibly important to biology because temperature is one of those components of an ecosystem, one of those non-living components that, as it turns out, is very important for living things within an ecosystem. And the other thing to keep in mind is, again, anytime you're looking at a graph, look at the scale here. This change that has been observed in the last couple hundred years is about a degree, maybe 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is relatively small, just compared to, the fluctuations that we experience from season to season or indoors to outdoors. This is not a huge thing in our terms of like everyday year-to-year life, but this 1.5 degrees Celsius change over the last 100 years is absolutely enough to impact many living things in many different ecosystems. So that's what I want to talk about next, is the effects that have been seen from these temperature changes. So, effects of global warming. This includes melting. So, high temperature melts ice. That's a pretty no-duh thing. And this increased temperature has led to loss of what's called the Arctic sea ice. So, let's look at the Arctic real quick. So, here we are. There's Greenland, there's Canada, there's Alaska, there's Russia up here, there'd be Santa's workshop somewhere in the middle here at the North Pole. And yeah, from season to season, the Arctic ice thaws and freezes again. It's just natural fluctuations that occur. But what we have been seeing is not changes from season to season. Even looking at this Arctic ice at the same season, these photographs from space are both from September, same month. So this is not seasonal changes we're looking at here. This is comparing the late 70s to 2020. In the late 70s, same month, this Arctic sea ice made it all the way up to Russia, all the way throughout this archipelago here in Canada. But flash forward 40 years later in 2020, that ice barely makes it to the places it used to in Canada, doesn't even touch Russia up here. There's way less of this ice sheet. Why does that matter? Well, as it turns out, ice is one of those non-living components that many organisms absolutely rely on. Polar bears do their hunting along the edges of the ice. If there's less ice, that means there aren't as many hunting grounds. This is negatively impacting the population, the carrying capacity, to go back to that concept, of polar bears. This is affecting seals as well. They give birth to their pups on the edges of these ice. There's less ice, it's less stable. They're being negatively affected by this as well. So yeah, loss of Arctic sea ice. This is something that is an important part of the overall Arctic ecosystem, and losing this ice affects animals that need it. Another effect of global warming actually doesn't have to do with temperature directly. It has to do with CO2. So we've got more atmospheric CO2, which means we've got more CO2 that naturally finds itself dissolved in water. This is mostly in oceans, because oceans are the biggest body of water on the planet. But yeah, more CO2 means more dissolved CO2. When CO2 is dissolved in water, it's converted to carbonic acid, just naturally. Carbonic acid is an acid. If you remember many chapters ago, acids lower the pH. And as it turns out, complicated chemical reactions here you don't need to worry about, but lower pH in the ocean, a more acidic ocean, interferes with certain chemical processes that are required to build calcium-containing compounds. Just dealing with calcium and trying to build stuff with calcium, handling calcium, becomes much more difficult when the water is more acidic. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but there are many animals within the ocean that use calcium for their shells. All these bivalves, clams and scallops and stuff, they're building their shells, they're strengthening it with calcium. Crustaceans like lobsters are strengthening their shells, their exoskeletons, using calcium-containing compounds. With a more acidic environment, they're not able to do that as well. Their shells and their exoskeletons are weaker, which makes them less resistant to predators, and sometimes not even being able to form a correct shell leads them to just not being able to live in the first place, just a failure to grow and develop, even without any predators trying to crunch down on them. So this doesn't directly have to do with temperature, it has to do with this CO2. So we call this ocean acidification. More CO2 in the air means more carbonic acid in the oceans. That means there's a lower pH in the oceans. This, to summarize, interferes with the formation of calcium carbonate, which many ocean invertebrates rely on for shell strength. And again, there are biologists studying this, tracking this, keeping track of population sizes and changes. And yeah, this ocean acidification is negatively affecting many ocean species that don't do well with a lower pH environment. Speaking of the oceans, there's another phenomenon that we see because of these warming temperatures, and that is something called coral bleaching. So coral, in its healthy form, is bright and vibrant and colorful. There are many different species of, these are sponges, but there are many different species of coral present in a coral reef. And yeah, they tend to have nice, healthy colors. This is what we call bleached coral, appropriately, because it's a ghostly white here, and it's dead. Or dying. When coral is dead or dying, it will lose its color and it will, look this sort of ghostly white. Importantly, well, let me do this. Importantly, corals are what is called a keystone species in the coral reef ecosystem. So I think this is the only key term for this particular chapter, so let me read what keystone species is. A keystone species is a species whose presence is key to upholding an ecological community's structure. So when the corals die, it's not just the coral that dies and everything else sort of takes its place. When the coral dies, everything else goes with it. So this is an incredibly rich, vibrant community with, you've got corals, you've got sponges, you've got fish, you've got ocean invertebrates like snails and stuff like that. But without the coral to support this, the whole thing collapses and it's more or less a dead zone. So losing the coral is losing the entire ecosystem. Many corals again, a lot of species of corals out there, but many of them are particularly sensitive to temperature and pH changes. So again, global warming is causing temperature changes, and the extra CO2, this sort of plays into ocean acidification as well. The lowered pH is killing these corals as well. And again, because these are keystone species, their death leads to death of the entire ecosystem, the entire coral reef. Now, I could go on because there are many, many other examples. Again, biologists across the globe are seeing these effects in many different ways, in many different ecosystems. I'm going to not go on too much more. I do want to note that all three of these examples, whether it was the bleaching of corals or these ocean invertebrates or the ice melting, all these have to do with the ocean. That's not a coincidence. Most of this extra heat energy is being absorbed by the ocean, which makes sense. The ocean is huge on the planet. Water is really great at absorbing excess energy. So, we do see effects of global warming in terrestrial ecosystems, but the ocean is absorbing most of this warmth, and we're seeing most of these effects in ocean ecosystems. Oceans absorb most effects of global warming. Okay. Now, there is one more example that I want to bring up when it comes to effects of global warming. And this speaks to the attitude of, well, who cares, right? These corals are pretty, and, it's bad that they're dead, but how does this affect us? These seals are adorable, and, there aren't so many of them or whatever. That's sad, but, so what? Well, this last sort of example or effect of global warming really speaks to that. Warming temperatures affect weather. So I'm not a meteorologist, but weather is affected by temperature. Warming temperatures affect the weather. So this can have a lot of effects. Warming temperature means more evaporation, which means more rainfall, especially closer to bodies of water. We're getting more flooding in the past 50 years or so because there's more evaporation, because there's a higher temperature. Now, all this rainfall coming in certain areas is leading to drought in other certain areas. All the rain that would normally rain here is, coming down earlier because more of it is precipitating. So we're seeing droughts in other parts of the world as well. And the droughts sort of play into increased wildfires as well. When it's drier than what we're used to, these areas are more prone to sometimes very large, very catastrophic wildfires. So, you may not care about, the seals and their population levels or whatever, but these effects on overall climate and on weather are absolutely affecting our cities and our infrastructures and our farms and our homes. This is something that is very directly affecting us. I want to point out, if we can go back to global temperature, if we go back millions and millions of years, the planet has been this hot before. The planet has been hotter than this before. The planet has experienced stuff way worse than this, but we have never experienced stuff worse than this. We have the planet in, a certain way that we are used to. We've built our farms and our houses and our cities in a very specific way, used to the planet having certain climate, having certain weather. These changes are very directly, negatively affecting us. So, in summary, warming temperatures affect weather, droughts, floods, wildfires. Now, I don't want to be too doom and gloom about all of this, so let's turn our attention now to trying to fix this. How do we make this better, or at least how do we prevent this from getting worse, reversing the effects of global warming? Well, all this started because we were, digging up hydrocarbons from the ground and, making them not be in the ground anymore, but being in the atmosphere. So first things first, we could try to do less of that. This is way easier said than done because we rely on these things for just so much of our everyday lives. But there are alternatives out there. Solar energy, wind energy, hydroelectric. As a biologist, obviously biofuels are a very attractive alternative energy production method. But there are ways out there to try to prevent this from getting worse, to try to reduce the amount of extra CO2 that we're digging up out of the ground and putting into the atmosphere. I'm just saying alternative energy sources. This will prevent things from getting worse, but if we want to make things get better, and again, better is all relative. If we want things to go back to normal, to what we are used to what we are accustomed to when we've built our farms and cities and houses and stuff like that. If we want things to get back to normal, we have to actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and the temperatures will go down in response. Again, we don't want to get rid of the atmosphere completely. We need this thing. We don't want the planet to be a barren, lifeless, cold husk like our moon. We need an atmosphere. We just only need so much of it. If we want to get things back to normal, we need to actually remove carbon, which we call carbon sequestration. This sounds incredibly complicated because what we need is a chemical reaction that can actually take CO2 from the air and transform it into solid form that's no longer in the air. This sounds like a wild chemical pathway. It's just photosynthesis. We talked about this earlier in the quarter. We already know what this pathway is. It's photosynthesis. And by growing more trees, where trees can be grown, and by growing more marshlands, or at the very least protecting the ones we have, these ecosystems act as what are called carbon sinks. They are fixing a lot of carbon from the air in order to grow these large trees, in order to grow all these grasses and their roots and just all of this sheer biomass. All the biomass within these plants is carbon that is not in the air. It's fixed into solid form. So by growing and protecting these sorts of ecosystems, we could sink out more of that carbon from the air and keep it locked in solid form within these living ecosystems. So carbon sequestration just means growing and protecting the existing forests and marshlands are two big examples. These things act as carbon sinks, sinking away that carbon from the air. Okay. Well, this was kind of a short one, but as we are getting to the end of the quarter, some of these lectures are going to be a little bit shorter. This brings me to the end of this chapter on biosphere and global climate change. This is the end of lecture 5.3. We'll start a fresh chapter in the next one as we really get towards the end of the quarter. But this one's the end of 5.3.